Picture this: a grand hall, lit by flickering torchlight, where kings lean forward in their thrones, not to hear the clash of steel, but the rise and fall of a storyteller's voice. In the medieval world, words weren't just entertainment. They were weapons sharper than any blade, tools of persuasion so powerful they could sway the hearts of monarchs and decide the fate of entire realms. This was an age where storytellers didn't just recite tales, they waged wars of wit, weaving narratives so compelling they could earn riches, titles, even a seat at the ruler's side. And sometimes the greatest prize of all, the throne itself. What if I told you that history's most pivotal moments weren't always decided on the battlefield? That behind the rise and fall of dynasties, there were whispers of allegory, the clever twist of a fable, or the emotional crescendo of an epic poem. These storytellers weren't mere entertainers, they were strategists, diplomats, and sometimes even kingmakers. Their battles played out in courts across Europe and beyond, where a single well-told story could humble a rival, flatter a sovereign, or plant the seeds of rebellion. The stakes, nothing less than power, legacy, and survival. So how did these verbal duels work? Imagine two masters of their craft, standing before a restless court, each spinning tales designed to outshine the other. One might weave a parable about a wise ruler who rewarded loyalty, while the other countered with a fable of arrogance leading to downfall, each word a carefully placed move in a high-stakes game. The audience wasn't just listening, they were being swayed, their emotions and allegiances shifting with every turn of phrase, and the rewards beyond gold or land. The victor might gain the ultimate currency, influence. Because in a world where kings believed stories held divine truths, the right tale could shape laws, inspire wars, or crown a new leader. This is the untold saga of how storytelling built empires, and you're about to step into that hall to witness the art that once moved mountains. The tradition of storytelling contests reaches back to the earliest human gatherings around campfires, in sacred groves, and at the feasting tables of tribal leaders. But when these verbal arts entered medieval courts, they transformed into something far more sophisticated. Picture a world where history wasn't written in books but carried on the breath of skilled narrators, where a well-spun tale could rewrite a king's legacy or justify an entire war. Bards and skalds weren't just performers, they were living libraries, diplomats, and sometimes even covert operatives, their words bending the minds of listeners like reeds in the wind. These contests didn't appear overnight. They grew from ancient customs like the Celtic fillies' poetic duels or the Viking skalds' boastful sagas, where honor and reputation hinged on verbal artistry. But in the candlelit halls of medieval nobility, the stakes grew higher. A storyteller's victory could mean patronage for life, land, titles, or a permanent seat at court. Defeat, disgrace, exile, or worse. Rulers quickly realized the power of these competitions. A cleverly crafted allegory could soften opposition to new taxes, while a heroic epic might unite fractious nobles under a shared identity. What made these contests so potent was their dual nature. On the surface, they were entertainment, a chance to marvel at rhyming couplets or thrilling adventures. But beneath the rhythm and metaphor lay razor-sharp persuasion. A story about a greedy merchant falling to ruin might warn against hoarding grain during a famine. A tale of betrayal could subtly undermine a rival lord's influence. The best storytellers mastered this delicate dance, wrapping hard truths in velvet narratives that left audiences both delighted and profoundly influenced. Consider the Welsh Eisteddfod, where bards competed for the coveted chair of oak leaves. a symbol of unmatched eloquence, or the Norse Althing, where skalds settled disputes not with weapons but with verses so piercing they could shame a chieftain into surrender. These weren't mere performances, they were psychological warfare waged with metaphor and cadence. And in an era when few could read, the storyteller's voice became the ultimate authority, shaping what people believed about their past, their rulers, even their gods. The most brilliant part, unlike swords or siege engines, stories were weapons that left no visible wounds. A king who executed a troublesome bard risked appearing tyrannical, but letting them speak meant surrendering control of the narrative. So rulers did the next best thing: they turned storytelling into sport, pitting wordsmiths against each other in contests they could quietly manipulate. The winner wasn't always the most skilled, but the one whose tale best served the crown's interests. And thus, the storyteller's art became a mirror of the world itself, a beautiful, dangerous game where truth and fiction blurred, and the prize was nothing less than the future. In the flickering torchlight of the royal court, the monarch wasn't just a spectator, they were the chessmaster, carefully observing which storytellers moved their narratives in alignment with the crown's agenda. A king's nod of approval could transform an unknown bard into a legend overnight, showering them with land, gold, or even a noble title. But the opposite was equally true. A single frown from the throne might silence a voice forever, as storytellers who strayed too close to uncomfortable truths often found themselves banished, or worse. This wasn't mere entertainment, it was a subtle, high-stakes negotiation of power. Take the court of Charlemagne, where the emperor famously surrounded himself with scholars and poets. To earn his favor, a storyteller's tale had to echo his vision of a unified Christian empire, heroic knights, divine justice, and the glory of conquest. Those who spun such stories were rewarded with positions as advisors, their words shaping imperial policy. But woe to the bard who dared recite an old pagan saga. Their fate served as a grim reminder of who controlled the narrative. The cleverest rulers understood that these contests were more than displays of wit, they were intelligence-gathering missions. By pitting storytellers against each other, monarchs could gauge the loyalty of their nobles. A tale praising a rival lord's generosity might reveal dangerous alliances, while a fable critiquing tyranny could hint at brewing dissent. Some kings, like England's Henry II, even used storytelling duels to settle legal disputes. Rather than risk civil war over a contested border, he'd order rival lords to commission poets. Their case would be argued not with swords, but with symbolism, metaphor, and the crowd's roaring approval. Perhaps the most fascinating power dynamic lay in the stories rulers didn't allow to be told. When the Welsh prince Llewellyn the Great banned all tales mentioning his father's disastrous reign, he wasn't just erasing history, he was rewriting it. In an age before mass media, controlling the storytellers meant controlling reality itself. That's why the shrewdest monarchs patronized multiple bards, creating the illusion of free expression while carefully steering the narrative. Like a puppeteer with invisible strings, they let their wordsmiths believe they were free artists, all while ensuring every parable, every allegory, served the throne's unspoken goals. The true genius of this system, it made the audience complicit. When a court cheered for a story glorifying their king's latest war, they weren't just being entertained, they were endorsing his rule. And that's why these storytelling duels endured for centuries. In the end, the greatest tale a monarch could weave was the one where the people believed they'd chosen the story themselves. Among these legendary wordsmiths, few names shine as brightly as Taliesin, the 6th century Welsh bard whose very existence straddles the line between history and myth. Said to possess the gift of prophecy, his poems didn't just entertain kings, they shaped destinies. One famous legend claims he survived a royal test by improvising a poem so dazzling it convinced a skeptical ruler he was no mere mortal, but a conduit of divine inspiration. Whether true or not, the tale reveals a deeper truth. In medieval courts, the right story could turn a wandering poet into a revered sage overnight. Then there's Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic historian and skald whose writings preserved Norse mythology for centuries. But don't mistake him for a mere scribe. Snorri was a political operator who used his stories as leverage, weaving sagas that subtly justified his own ambitions. His Heimskringla, a chronicle of Norwegian kings, wasn't just history, it was a masterclass in flattery, designed to win favor with powerful rulers by portraying their ancestors as heroic figures touched by the gods. But not all these storytellers were men. Hidden in the margins of history are figures like Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, the 10th century German canoness who turned biblical tales into gripping dramas. In an era when women's voices were often silenced, her plays became covert tools of persuasion, using saintly heroines to argue for female agency under the guise of piety. Even Marie de France, the enigmatic 12th century poet, wielded her fables like daggers. Her story of a werewolf knight, for instance, wasn't just fantasy but a sly critique of feudal betrayal. What united these masters was their understanding of narrative as currency. A skald like Egil Skallagrimson could compose a biting insult poem so vicious it forced a king to pay him in gold just to stop. Meanwhile, the anonymous bards of Irish courts used satire as social control. A well-aimed verse could ruin a noble's reputation faster than any scandal. These weren't just artists, they were psychological tacticians trading in the most potent weapon of all, the human imagination, and that's what made them dangerous. When a storyteller like Taliesin claimed his words came from otherworldly visions, or when Snorri implied his sagas were divinely inspired, they weren't just boasting, they were claiming authority beyond mortal challenge. Because in a world where stories shaped reality, the person who controlled the narrative didn't just entertain the throne. In a very real sense, they helped build it. To understand the sheer brilliance of these verbal battles, we must step into the arena itself where stories became dueling blades, and every pause held the weight of a killing stroke. Picture two storytellers standing at opposite ends of the hall, the air thick with anticipation. The first round might begin with a simple challenge, a tale of valor perhaps, or a riddle wrapped in metaphor. But this was just the opening gambit. Like chess masters, competitors saved their most devastating moves for later, each turn ratcheting up the tension. The rules were as precise as they were demanding. In Norse traditions, a skald might have to improvise verses in complex meters, weaving in hidden compliments to the king or veiled insults to rivals. Celtic bards faced even steeper odds. Their poems had to adhere to strict syllable counts, all while threading in layers of symbolism that only the most learned listeners could fully unravel. A single misstep, a clumsy rhyme or heavy-handed moral, and the crowd would turn like a tide, their jeers as lethal as any blade. Audiences weren't passive observers, they were active participants, their reactions a barometer of a tale's power. A well-timed gasp, a collective laugh, or even stunned silence could sway the ruler's judgment. That's why the shrewdest storytellers studied their crowds like generals surveying a battlefield. A hall full of merchants might demand tales of cunning and trade, while warriors thirsted for bloody epics, and if the ruler had a fondness for falconry or scripture, the winning story would soar on wings of allegory, leaving no doubt which teller truly understood the heart of their sovereign. The most legendary duels weren't won by flashy theatrics alone. True mastery lay in the pivot the moment a storyteller took their rival's theme, and twisted it into something entirely new. Imagine one bard extolling a king's generosity through a fable of golden harvests, only for their opponent to counter with a darker tale of greed's consequences, all while maintaining the same rhythm and meter. This wasn't just storytelling, it was psychological warfare where the victor proved they could outthink, outfeel, and ultimately outmaneuver their adversary on every level. Endurance played a role too. Some contests stretched for days with competitors pushed to their limits. The Irish croissant or satirist might chant for hours, layering insult upon insult until their target surrendered in humiliation. Meanwhile, in continental courts, the rules often demanded variety. A romance followed by a tragedy, then a ribald jest, proving the teller's range was as vast as their wit. At its core, this structure transformed storytelling from art into sport, where creativity and cunning collided under the watchful eyes of power. And when the final tale faded into silence, the winner wasn't just the one with the prettiest words, it was the one who made the entire room believe, even for a moment, that their story was the only one that ever mattered. Allegory wasn't just a storytelling technique, it was a survival strategy. In courts where speaking truth to power could mean losing your tongue or your head, the cleverest narrators mastered the art of saying everything without ever saying it outright. Take the medieval bestiary tradition, where animals became stand-ins for human flaws and virtues. A storyteller might spin a fable about a proud lion who refused to listen to his advisors, only to lose his kingdom to a cunning fox. On the surface, it's entertainment, but every noble in the room would recognize the unspoken critique. A ruler's arrogance could be his undoing, the genius. If challenged, the teller could shrug and say, "It's just a story about animals." Symbolism worked similarly, but with even sharper precision. When the 14th century poet Dante placed corrupt popes in the inferno of his Divine Comedy, he wasn't merely imagining hell, he was publishing a scathing indictment of the church while avoiding outright heresy. By wrapping his criticism in vivid imagery and biblical allusions, he gave readers the tools to decode his message while maintaining plausible deniability. This was storytelling as intellectual guerrilla warfare, where the real meaning hid in plain sight, waiting for the right minds to uncover it. The most effective allegories functioned like psychological keys, unlocking thoughts the audience didn't realize they were allowed to have. Consider the Arthurian legends, where the quest for the Holy Grail symbolized spiritual purity. On one level, it inspired knights to higher ideals, but beneath that, it subtly reinforced the church's authority by framing divine approval as the ultimate prize. Even King Arthur's Round Table, a symbol of equality, served a dual purpose. While it flattered nobles by suggesting they ruled alongside their king, it also reminded them that challenging the throne meant disrupting cosmic order. Some storytellers took this further, embedding layers of meaning only certain listeners could decipher. Sufi poets like Rumi wrote love poems that, to the uninitiated, seemed romantic. But to their disciples, every mention of wine or the beloved secretly pointed to divine union. Similarly, Celtic bards used place name legends to encode territorial claims. A tale about a hero burying treasure on a hill might actually document ancestral land rights. In societies where written records were rare or controlled, these stories became living legal documents passed down through generations. What made this coded communication so powerful was its flexibility. A single story could mean one thing to peasants, another to nobles, and something entirely different to the king himself. Like a hall of mirrors, the reflections shifted depending on where you stood. And that's why allegory endured long after medieval times, because the best stories never just tell us something, they let us discover it for ourselves, making the message feel not like a command, but like our own brilliant idea. Charlemagne's court wasn't just a seat of power, it was a stage where history itself could be rewritten with the right words. When rival bards arrived to compete for the title of imperial chronicler, they weren't just vying for prestige, they were fighting to control how future generations would remember an empire. The rules were simple: weave tales so compelling they'd convince Charlemagne his legacy was inseparable from their narratives, but the stakes, nothing less than the immortality of a king's reputation. One contender, a Frankish bard named Angilbert, staked his claim with epic poems framing Charlemagne as a second Constantine, divinely chosen to unite Christendom. His verses pulsed with battlefield glory and celestial signs, each stanza reinforcing the emperor's image as heaven's favored ruler. But his rival, the Lombard scholar Paul the Deacon, took a subtler approach. Instead of outright flattery, he spun intricate histories linking Charlemagne to the great Roman emperors of old, suggesting his reign wasn't just impressive, it was inevitable, the natural culmination of centuries of destiny. The tension between these two styles revealed the contest's deeper game. Angilbert's bombastic tales thrilled the crowd, but Paul's quieter, scholarly tone resonated with Charlemagne's ambition to be seen as a philosopher king. Here was the unspoken truth: winning the emperor's favor wasn't about raw talent alone. It was about anticipating which version of himself he wished to see reflected in the world's eyes. Charlemagne's eventual choice, Paul the Deacon, rewrote history in ways still felt today. By commissioning him to document the Lombard kingdom's fall, the emperor ensured the story would emphasize his mercy and wisdom, not the bloodshed of conquest. Overnight, rebellions became uprisings of misguided souls, and sieges transformed into necessary acts of divine justice. The losers of this contest, their versions of events vanished like smoke, leaving only the victor's narrative etched into parchment and memory. Yet the real masterstroke was how Charlemagne used these stories beyond his court. Copies of Paul's chronicles spread to monasteries across Europe, becoming the definitive account of his reign. Future historians would rely on them, unaware they were reading not objective truth, but a carefully crafted legend. And that's the ultimate power of such contests. When storytelling becomes history, the victor doesn't just win a title, they win eternity. Religion wasn't just a backdrop in these storytelling duels, it was the ultimate source of authority, a wellspring of metaphors so potent they could crown kings or topple them. When a medieval bard invoked the story of David and Goliath, it wasn't merely entertainment, it was a coded message. A small, righteous underdog overcoming a tyrant. That could stir rebellion if whispered in the right ears, but flip the script, frame the king as God's anointed, like Solomon in his wisdom, and suddenly dissent became sacrilege. The church's grip on daily life meant religious tales weren't just stories, they were the language of power itself. Consider how saintly miracles became political tools. A storyteller in the court of Philip II of France might recount the legend of Saint Louis healing scrofula with his touch, a not-so-subtle hint that the current king's lineage carried divine favor. Meanwhile, a rival could counter with the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, suggesting the crown's taxes were starving the poor. The brilliance lay in the deniability. Challenge a religious tale, and you risked challenging the faith itself, a gamble few dared take. Even the structure of these stories mirrored sacred texts. A skilled teller would weave in echoes of the Psalms' parallelism or the Gospel's parables, making their narrative feel inevitable, as if whispered by angels. When the Welsh bard Hywel ab Owain Gwynedd described his patron's victory as like Joshua at Jericho, the walls of his enemy's reputation crumbled before the audience's ears. Biblical references weren't just decoration, They were psychological anchors, tethering the listener's trust to something beyond mortal doubt. But the holiest tales could also be the most subversive. Take the medieval tale of the three living and the three dead, where kings encounter their own rotting doppelgangers, a stark memento mori. Told at a feast, it could humble a proud ruler. Told in a rebel camp, it might justify revolt. The church's own stories, meant to teach piety, became double-edged swords in the hands of clever narrators, because in a world where heaven and earth were thought to touch daily, the right sacred illusion could make a storyteller's words sound less like opinion and more like prophecy. What made this interplay so dangerous was its universality. Peasants and nobles alike knew these tales, making religious storytelling the ultimate democratic weapon. A queen might commission a lavish manuscript to burnish her image, but a traveling friar could undo it all with a well-placed sermon about Herod's vanity. The battlefield wasn't just the court, it was the pulpit, the marketplace, the fireside, anywhere voices could weave divine narratives into human ambition. And in that contest, the prize wasn't just earthly power, but the soul of history itself. Laughter in a medieval hall wasn't just relief from the weight of crowns and politics, it was a weapon honed to a razor's edge. Imagine a storyteller pausing mid-tale, locking eyes with a rival lord, and delivering a joke so perfectly barbed it drew roaring applause while leaving the target too stunned to retaliate. This was satire's alchemy, transforming mockery into social currency, where the right punchline could elevate a bard to favor or bury an enemy in disgrace. But the line between court jester and court poison was perilously thin. One moment, a jester's quip about a noble's failed hunt might have the king wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. The next, a similar jab at the wrong advisor could land the teller in the stocks. The secret lay in what humor concealed. When the 12th century troubadour Macabre sang of knights chasing shadows instead of honor, his audience howled, but beneath the laughter, his barbs exposed the hypocrisy of nobles who neglected their duties. Likewise, the Welsh Cywyddau poets mastered the art of the backhanded compliment, praising a lord's generosity while slyly noting his empty coffers. The brilliance offense could always be denied. Surely my lord takes no issue with mere entertainment, a bard might say, widening their eyes in feigned innocence as the court's laughter trapped the target in a choice, erupt in anger and seem petty, or swallow the insult and lose face. Yet satire's true power emerged in its surgical precision. A generic joke about gluttony might amuse, but a tale about a boar who ate so much it rivaled Lord Such and Such's feasts personalized the sting. The Icelandic nith tradition took this further, carving insults into nithstang poles, literal effigies designed to shame enemies through verse. But the cleverest satirists avoided direct hits altogether. Instead, they'd craft allegorical animal fables where a pompous peacock bore a suspicious resemblance to the king's overbearing chancellor. Plausible deniability became their shield. After all, how could anyone prove the peacock wasn't just a peacock? Humor also served as social leveler. When the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II allowed his court jester to mock him publicly, it wasn't just amusement, it was theater, showcasing his confidence by proving he could withstand ridicule. Conversely, a ruler who punished every jest revealed thin skin, a weakness rivals might exploit. This delicate dance turned laughter into a gauge of power. The more secure the monarch, the sharper the satire they permitted, so long as it ultimately reinforced their authority. The masters of this craft understood something timeless: laughter disarms before it strikes. A crowd chuckling at a story about a greedy bishop is already halfway to believing the critique. And in an era when outright dissent meant treason, satire became the safest way to speak truth wrapped in a grin, delivered with a wink but carrying the weight of an axe. Behind the tapestry of medieval storytelling contests, where men dominated the public stages, women were quietly rewriting the rules from convents, noble chambers, and even royal courts. Take the remarkable case of the 12th century Trobarits, female troubadours of Occitania, who composed poetic duels called tensos. Unlike their male counterparts singing of chivalric love, these women, like the Countess of Dyer, turned the genre on its head, penning verses that demanded reciprocity in romance. Her famous "A chanta emer de so quiu non volria" wasn't just a lament, it was a manifesto disguised as a love song, exposing the hypocrisy of knights who praised courtly devotion while treating real women as property. Convents became unexpected hotbeds of narrative rebellion. Hertzwitha of Gandersheim, the 10th century Saxon canoness, didn't merely transcribe saints' lives, she dramatized them with female protagonists who outwitted tormentors through wit and faith. In her play Sapientia, the titular philosopher debates the Emperor Hadrian with such brilliance that her daughters choose martyrdom over submission, a clear allegory for intellectual resistance. These stories circulated among noblewomen, offering coded lessons in resilience. Even embroidery became a storytelling medium. The Bayeux Tapestry's unknown female designers slipped subtle critiques of Norman aggression into its stitches, like the enigmatic figure of Elfgiva, a woman caught in a scandal that historians still debate was political slander or protest. What made these women's strategies so ingenious was their use of accepted forms as Trojan horses. Marie de France's Lie's short romantic poems seemed to uphold feudal values until you noticed the patterns. Shape-shifting lovers escaping arranged marriages, werewolves symbolizing betrayed trust, and queens wielding magic to reclaim agency. Her Lanval turns the Arthurian world upside down, with a knight saved not by his sword, but by a fairy mistress whose wealth and power dwarf Camelot's. The message: even in a man's world, feminine realms held untapped might. The most subversive tales often hid in plain sight as children's stories. When the 14th century Italian writer Christine de Pizan penned the Book of the City of Ladies, she framed it as a dream vision, a respectable format. But within its walls, she gathered history's forgotten heroines, from warrior queens to inventors, proving women's contributions were everywhere if men bothered to look. Her contemporary, the mystic Julian of Norwich, went further, reimagining Christ as a mother in her revelations of divine love, destabilizing millennia of patriarchal theology with a single metaphor. These storytellers faced risks male bards never fathomed. A satirical skald might lose patronage for mocking his lord, but a woman critiquing marriage norms could be branded a heretic. That's why their victories resonate so deeply. They weren't just winning contests, they were dismantling entire systems of thought, one carefully coded tale at a time. And though history tried to erase many of their names, their stories refused to die, whispering across centuries that power isn't always taken by the sword. Sometimes it's spun by the spindle. The tradition of storytellers dueling for influence didn't fade with the clatter of armored knights or the fall of castle walls. It simply evolved, slipping into new disguises across the centuries. Renaissance courts may have traded mead halls for marble galleries, but the game remained the same. Poets like Petrarch and Dante didn't just write sonnets, they weaponized them, competing for patronage by crafting verses that flattered rulers while subtly schooling them. When Lorenzo de Medici hosted poetry contests in Florence, the winners weren't chosen for technical skill alone. Their true mastery lay in threading political commentary through mythological allegories, turning a tale of Apollo and Daphne into a lesson on Medici power or a warning against overreach. Fast forward to the 18th century, and you'll find Voltaire and Rousseau locked in a very public battle of wits, their pamphlets and philosophical fables serving as proxy wars for Enlightenment ideals. Voltaire's Candide wasn't just satire, It was a storytelling duel with the church and monarchy, his razor-sharp parody exposing hypocrisy more effectively than any manifesto. Meanwhile, salons across Europe became the new arenas, where hostesses like Madame Geoffrin judged intellectual skirmishes as ruthlessly as any medieval king. The tools had changed: quills instead of lyres, printing presses amplifying voices, but the stakes were identical: shape the narrative, control the future. Even today, the DNA of these medieval contests pulses through modern life. Political debates, their storytelling duels where candidates weave personal anecdotes into policy pitches, hoping to win the room like bards of old. Corporate branding, its court patronage rebranded, with companies commissioning narratives to cast themselves as heroes in the public imagination. And consider the viral spread of conspiracy theories, a dark twist on the medieval tradition, where emotionally charged tales bypass logic to sway belief. The mechanisms are eerily familiar: repetition, emotional hooks, and the veneer of hidden truth. Perhaps the purest modern airs are competitive storytelling events like the Moth or Slam poetry slams. Watch a performer hold a crowd spellbound with a personal story, and you're witnessing the same alchemy that once earned bards land grants, transforming raw experience into shared meaning, where applause functions as the new feudal favor. Even social media follows the old rules. Viral threads are today's sagas, with upvotes and shares acting as digital fealty to the most compelling narrators. The through line is undeniable. Whether in a Viking hall or a TED Talk stage, humans still crown kings and topple regimes with stories. The difference now: we're all potential storytellers, and the throne is up for grabs by anyone who can make the world lean in and listen. The greatest storytellers didn't just memorize lines, they danced on the edge of disaster, spinning gold from thin air as the court's mood shifted like wind through a drafty hall. Imagine standing before a fidgeting king halfway through a heroic epic when a messenger whispers news of a rebellion. Suddenly, your tale of a loyal knight needs to pivot fast into a parable about unity and forgiveness, all while keeping the rhythm flawless and the crowd none the wiser. This was the razor's edge of improvisation, where a single hesitation could unravel years of reputation. Take the legendary Irish bard Turlough O'Carolan, blind since childhood, who once found himself performing for a lord secretly grieving his son's death. Sensing the room's heaviness, O'Carolan abandoned his planned rollicking tune and instead plucked a melody so hauntingly tender that the lord reportedly wept, then rewarded him with land for his perceptiveness. That's the alchemy of true improvisation, transforming silence, tension, even disaster into narrative advantage. The techniques these masters used would feel familiar to modern jazz musicians or improv comedians. Call and response patterns let them gauge the crowd's energy, adjusting themes on the fly. Formulaic phrases like the Norse kenning, "Whale Road" for sea acted as placeholders while their minds raced ahead. Some, like the Welsh Cypher Widiad, trained in branching stories, memorizing dozens of plot variants to deploy based on whether the audience leaned toward romance, satire, or bloodshed. A single raised eyebrow from a duchess might flip a tragic ending into a comic twist, or a drunken noble's heckle could spawn a subplot mocking his own family crest, all without missing a beat. Rivals exploited this fluidity ruthlessly. In one Icelandic saga, a skald named Gunnlaugur Snaketongue improvised an insult so clever it rhymed with his opponent's own unfinished verse, stealing both the punchline and the crowd's favor. The best duels became psychological chess matches, where anticipating the other's narrative moves mattered as much as crafting your own. A French trouver might begin a romance about two star-crossed lovers, only for his competitor to yes and the tale into a cautionary fable about reckless passion, forcing the first teller to either concede the moral high ground or pivot again. What separated the gifted from the legendary was their ability to make improvisation invisible. When the Anglo-Saxon Scop Dior faced a coughing fit mid-performance, he seamlessly wove it into his Lay of Welland, gasping out lines about the smith's labored breathing as if scripted all along. Such moments didn't just preserve the story's flow, they deepened its authenticity, making audiences feel they were witnessing truth, not craft. Because in the end, the greatest trick these storytellers pulled wasn't just thinking on their feet. It was making everyone forget their feet existed at all. For every bard who won lands and titles with their silver tongue, another vanished into the shadows, or worse, for crossing the invisible line between clever and careless. Take the fate of the 11th century Norse skald Hallfredr, whose sharp wit once earned him a king's favor, but when he composed a verse subtly comparing his new patron to a greedy wolf, the laughter died in the hall. The punishment, not just exile, but a curse ordered to compose a praise poem so magnificent it would erase the insult or face execution. Hallfredr's eventual success became legend, but the lesson echoed through every court. A storyteller's words could be their noose as easily as their crown. Even the most celebrated wordsmiths danced on knives. The Welsh bard Dafydd ap Gwilym, renowned for his playful erotic poetry, narrowly avoided mutilation when a jealous husband, rumored to be a powerful lord, took his verses as personal affronts. Only a hastily improvised satire mocking his own arrogance diffused the threat. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the poet Theodore Prodromos learned the hard way that humor at the emperor's expense had limits. His cheeky critique of palace extravagance, disguised as a fable about ants and cicadas, earned him a year in a dungeon where he reportedly wrote penitent verses on the walls with his own fingernails. The gravest dangers lurked in stories that hit too close to home. When the Irish bard Óengus Óacute Daleg recounted an ancient tale of a tyrant overthrown by his people, the local ruler, known for his heavy taxes, heard not a historical lesson but a call to rebellion. Óacute Daleg's tongue was nailed to a post as a warning to others. Such punishments weren't merely cruelty, they were calculated theater. A maimed poet served as a living reminder that some truths, even wrapped in allegory, could shatter the fragile illusion of a ruler's infallibility. Women storytellers faced doubly lethal stakes. The Trobaritz Casillosa didn't just risk artistic failure, her bold poems challenging marital norms saw her branded a heretic by the church, her works nearly erased. Only fragments survived, smuggled out by sympathetic scribes. Even anonymous tales spun by peasant women carried peril. A cunning folk story about a weaver outsmarting a corrupt sheriff might delight villagers, but if it reached the sheriff's ears, whole families could find themselves homeless after a mysterious fire. Yet the most chilling consequence wasn't death or mutilation, it was silence. When the Mongol conquest swept through Persia, countless storytellers were ordered to cease reciting the Shahnameh, the epic chronicle of pre-Islamic kings. To comply meant erasing cultural memory, to resist meant annihilation. Some chose a third path, whispering Ferdowsi's verses in hidden courtyards, ensuring the stories lived even as tellers vanished. Because in the end, the darkest truth of these battles wasn't just the price of speaking, it was the cost of being forced to stop. In the smoky halls of medieval Ireland, justice wasn't always delivered with gavels or parchment. Sometimes it arrived wrapped in rhyme and meter. The ancient Brehon laws, practiced by Celtic societies, allowed poets known as fili to settle disputes through storytelling contests so intricate they functioned as courtroom testimony. Picture two landowners locked in a bitter boundary feud. Instead of presenting deeds or witnesses, each would commission a poet to craft a narrative, one tracing the land's history through heroic ancestors, the other invoking myths of divine gifts. The winning tale didn't just entertain, it became legal precedent, its verdict binding as any judge's decree. This fusion of art and law relied on a shared belief that truth lived not just in facts but in the stories a community chose to uphold. Norse thing assemblies took this further, where skalds recited genealogical poems to prove inheritance claims. A single well-remembered verse could confirm who rightfully owned a farm, as these oral records carried the weight of written contracts. The trick, the poet had to weave their case in drotfeet meter, a complex 8-line stanza forcing legal arguments into such rigid form that any flaw in rhythm might hint at a flaw in logic. But the real power lay in storytelling's ability to reframe reality. When Welsh bards were called to settle blood feuds, they didn't merely recount events. They constructed parables where forgiveness brought prosperity and vengeance led to ruin. A lord might arrive demanding retribution, only to leave persuaded by a tale of two brothers whose quarrel doomed their village. Here, the storyteller wasn't just an advocate. They were a psychological architect, rebuilding the audience's understanding of justice itself. The system's brilliance was its flexibility. Where rigid legal codes failed to address nuance, stories could hold contradictions, acknowledging a thief's crime while contextualizing his desperation. In one Icelandic saga, a skald named Snorri resolved a murder trial by recounting the killer's dreams as prophetic visions, reframing homicide as tragic fate. The victim's family accepted compensation not because the law demanded it, but because the story made grief comprehensible. Yet this practice had its shadows. Clever poets could weaponize ambiguity, like the Irish filly who proved a client's innocence by singing of a shapeshifter taking their form during the crime. And when rulers like King James I of Scotland banned storytelling verdicts, it wasn't just about centralizing power, it was fear of narratives escaping control. Because once people believed a story's justice more than a crown's who needed kings, what lingers today is the bone-deep human instinct to shape truth through tale. Modern jury deliberations still hinge on which attorney's narrative feels more right, while indigenous cultures continue oral traditions to assert land rights. The medieval world simply acknowledged what we often forget. Every law is just a story someone once told convincingly enough to make others obey. A harp's trembling string could make a battle's clash feel real. A drum's sudden thunder might mimic a dragon's roar. In the hands of a master storyteller, music wasn't just accompaniment. It was the invisible hand shaping every gasp and sigh from the audience. Picture a Norse skald plucking the langspiel, its droning notes building tension as he described Odin's sacrifice on Yggdrasil. Or a Celtic bard strumming the crute, her melody swelling as Cuchulainn faced his final stand. These performers understood something timeless. The right chord at the right moment could make listeners feel the story in their bones, not just hear it. The instruments themselves were characters in the tale. The Anglo-Saxon lyre, with its 6 gut strings, lent gravity to epic verses about Beowulf's feats. Meanwhile, the Moorish-derived lute in Spanish courts added exotic flair to tales of El Cid, its fluttering notes evoking desert winds and clashing scimitars. But the true sorcery lay in how musicians bent their craft to the story's needs. A Welsh cyfarwyd might slow his harp to a crawl when recounting a lover's death, letting each dissonant note hang like a tear. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he'd launch into a frenzied jig as the hero's ghost returned for vengeance, a proof that rhythm could manipulate time itself, stretching seconds into agonies or blurring years into heartbeats. Vocal techniques were equally potent weapons. Icelandic rimmer singers mastered a haunting 2-tone harmony called tívisöngur, their voices intertwining like fate's threads in a saga. In Provence, troubadours employed the vox oris, a whispered, intimate tone for scandalous verses, then switched to thunderous declamation when praising their patron's lineage. The Breton bards even had a secret language of coughs and pauses. A well-timed clearing of the throat could signal a veiled insult to allies while sailing over rivals' heads. Yet the body was the ultimate instrument. Irish filly trained for years in Cogwaint, the art of precision gesture, a raised pinky, might suggest a queen's disdain, while a sudden crouch could transform the teller into a lurking assassin. Byzantine storytellers went further, using intricate hand signs from church liturgy to add subliminal layers, fingers forming a cross during a villain's oath, or tracing a hidden fish symbol when speaking of faith. The most skilled performers turned their entire presence into a living illusion. One account describes a Saxon scop who recounted a snowstorm so convincingly, shivering listeners drew their cloaks tight, though the hall stood warm. This multimedia brilliance reached its peak in competitive duels, where every element became ammunition. A Frankish bard might drown out his rival's tale with a fortissimo chord, forcing the opponent to either raise his voice and seem crude or pause and lose momentum. Others used silence as a blade, halting mid-sentence while plucking a single, quavering note, leaving the crowd leaning forward in unbearable anticipation. The Welsh even had a term for this lethal showmanship, cyphered, meaning both enchantment and strategic dazzle, because in the end, the best stories didn't just live in the mind. They raced through the blood, danced on the skin, and echoed in the hollows of the chest long after the last note faded. From the misty highlands of Scotland to the bustling souks of Damascus, the art of competitive storytelling took wildly different shapes, yet always kept its razor edge. Celtic Philid didn't just recite poems, they weaponized them in flyting duels where rhyming insults could strip a rival of honor faster than a sword. Their verses adhered to strict Don Diarach meter, a linguistic straitjacket that made each syllable a potential landmine. A single misplaced consonant might imply cowardice, while a perfectly crafted alliteration could elevate a chieftain's lineage to mythic status. Meanwhile, in Arabia, the Hakawatis wove their battles through coffeehouse performances, where applause decided the winner. Their secret weapon, the art of tarab, a rhythmic cadence that sent shivers down spines, turning Quranic parables into political commentary so subtle, only the sharpest listeners caught the double meanings. Scandinavia took a fiercer approach. Viking skalds competed in Manjafnatha, a contest where the stakes weren't just reputation, but life itself. A poorly composed dropper about a jarl's battle prowess might earn an axe to the skull, while a brilliant one could net you an arm ring of solid gold. Their trick was embedding insults in praise. Calling a lord generous as the rain sounded flattering until you remembered Norse rain often came sideways in freezing gales. Over in Japan, the tradition of rakugo comedians turned verbal duels into high art. Seated on silk cushions, they'd act out entire battles using only a fan and facial expressions. A single raised eyebrow could transform the prop into a betraying lover's letter or a general's war banner. The contrasts revealed deeper cultural fingerprints. Persian, Nakali performers clad in embroidered robes recited the Shahnameh with ceremonial swords, their sweeping gestures mirroring the epic's battlefield arcs. Compare this to the Cherokee, Adeyeski, where storytellers used animal masks and rhythmic stomping to transform creation myths into communal experiences. What united them all was the understanding that stories weren't just told, they were performed, with every culture's values etched into their delivery. The Welsh prioritized triadic repetition. Truth comes in threes, while Ottoman meta-storytellers punctuated tales with a wooden spoon's crack against a copper tray, a sound that still echoes in Turkish cafes today. Perhaps the most striking difference lay in audience participation. West African griots expected call and response, turning stories into living dialogues where the crowd's energy could steer the narrative. But in the silent courts of Heian-era Japan, a poet's slightest stutter could doom their career. These variations weren't accidents, they reflected who held power. Loose, interactive styles thrived in egalitarian societies, while rigid forms dominated hierarchical ones. Yet from the Arctic to the Sahara, one rule held true: the best stories didn't just win contests. They shaped worlds. The greatest storytellers didn't just speak to the crowd, they spoke through them, turning audiences into unwitting accomplices in their verbal conquests. Imagine a bard pausing mid-tale to lock eyes with a restless noble, then subtly altering his next line to mirror that lord's recent hunting triumph. Suddenly, the noble isn't just listening, he's invested, his ego tethered to the story's success. This was the dark art of audience mirroring, where tellers reflected listeners' lives back at them, forging bonds no mere flattery could break. Psychological warfare began long before the first word was spoken. Skilled storytellers arrived early to study the hall's dynamics, which nobles sat closest to the throne, whose laughter sounded forced, which advisors leaned in when money or marriage was mentioned. Like gamblers counting cards, they catalogued vulnerabilities: a duke sensitive about his limp, a queen obsessed with astrological omens. Then they weaponized those observations. A Norse skald might weave a tale of a crippled smith who forged a legendary sword, transforming the duke's shame into admiration. A Byzantine chronicler could predict a celestial event during his story's climax, ensuring the queen saw divine favor in his words. Timing was everything. The shrewdest tellers knew when to deploy humor like a scalpel. A well-placed joke about pompous advisors could unite the room against a shared enemy, while a mistimed jibe might turn the crowd frosty. Emotional escalation became their secret weapon. Start with light-hearted fables to lower defenses, then pivot to a heart-wrenching tragedy about betrayal, just as the king's rival entered the hall. Watch the ruler's jaw tighten, his suspicions of disloyalty now framed by the storyteller's narrative. Rivals were dismantled with even subtler precision. Before a competition, master tellers spread forgotten verses in taverns, lines so clumsy they couldn't possibly be their own, but just similar enough to cast doubt on their opponent's skill. Others employed the false flaw tactic, pretending to stumble over a word only to reveal it as a pun that made the crowd roar. The goal: make competitors seem either predictable or incompetent by comparison. But the true masters saved their cruelest tricks for the finale. A well-trained bard could end his tale with an unfinished chord, leaving the audience physically tense until the king himself demanded resolution, a power play disguised as artistry. Or worse, he'd trail off with a line that echoed his rival's opening gambit, trapping them in a narrative loop they couldn't escape without admitting defeat. These weren't just stories, they were spiderwebs, each strand placed to vibrate at the lightest touch, ensuring every listener walked away entangled in the teller's vision of the world. A fox's cunning, a lion's pride, a serpent's whisper. Medieval storytellers knew the power of cloaking human drama in fur and feathers. These animal fables weren't just children's tales, they were a linguistic camouflage, allowing bards to skewer corruption or flatter kings without risking their necks. Take the famous Reynard the Fox cycle, where a sly red predator outmaneuvers noble wolves and dim-witted bears. To peasants, it was comedy; to the nobility, a mirror held up to their own court's backstabbing, where the wolf in the story might bear a striking resemblance to the tax-collecting baron who just visited their village. The genius lay in the layers. Aesop's The Ant and the Grasshopper could preach thrift to merchants one day, then morph into a warning for knights about preparing for winter sieges the next. Even the choice of animals carried coded meaning. In French courts, a hedgehog's spines might symbolize a kingdom's defenses, while Byzantine tellers used peacocks to critique vanity in clergy, their iridescent feathers echoing stained glass hypocrisy. Some creatures became regional shorthand. Welsh bards cast otters as treacherous allies, a nod to their slippery reputations in local rivers, whereas Norse skalds turned ravens into omens of battle, their black wings foreshadowing the Valkyries' arrival. But the most subversive fables played a double game. Marie de France's The Wolf and the Lamb seemed like a simple morality tale until listeners noticed the wolf's arguments mirrored the exact justifications their duke used for raising taxes. The moment that click of recognition hit, the story ceased to be about animals at all. That's why rulers both loved and feared these tales. A king might commission a fable about bees to promote industry among his subjects, only to find his people humming a rebel version where the hive overthrows its oppressive queen. Animals also offered psychological distance. When a storyteller described a falcon betraying its falconer, the audience could ponder betrayal's sting without immediately thinking of their own treacherous uncle. This buffer made tough truths digestible. After all, who could protest a lesson about, say, a greedy badger hoarding acorns? Yet by the tale's end, the lord squirming in his seat knew exactly which of his granaries the story was really targeting. Perhaps the shrewdest twist was how these fables crossed class lines. A servant might chuckle at a donkey outsmarting its master, while the noble in the same room admired the beast's noble perseverance. Same story, two truths, and the teller could always claim innocence. It's just a silly animal tale, they'd shrug, even as the real message took root like a seed in winter soil, ready to sprout when the season turned. While kings and nobles battled for control of courtly narratives, another breed of storytellers roamed the muddy roads between towns' minstrels whose stages were tavern hearths, market squares, and the flickering camps of pilgrim caravans. These wanderers carried more than loot cases and patchwork cloaks. Their minds were living libraries, stuffed with tales gathered from 100 crossroads. Picture a Breton jongleur slipping Arabic numerals into an Arthurian romance after hearing them in Moorish Andalusia, or a Saxon gleeman blending Norse frost giants with Mediterranean sirens to thrill seaside villagers. Their stories weren't just entertainment, they were cultural alchemy, transforming foreign wonders into local treasures with each retelling. The true magic lay in adaptation. A Frankish chanson digest about Charlemagne might sprout dragon-slaying episodes when performed in the Carpathians, where dragon lore ran deep. Meanwhile, Byzantine adventure tales gained camel caravans and desert djinns as they traveled Silk Road caravanserais. This wasn't careless distortion, it was survival. Minstrels' new audiences embraced stories that mirrored their own landscapes and fears. That's why the Welsh Mabinogian's otherworld resembles misty glens, while Sicilian versions of the same myths shimmer with volcano fire. These travelers didn't just spread tales, they grafted them onto local roots, letting them grow new branches. Their influence reached further than any army. When the Armenian troubadour Sayat Nova sang Persian ghazals in Georgian courts, he wasn't just performing, he was smuggling entire worldviews across political borders. Similarly, the Roma people's pan-European storytelling wove Hindu deities into Slavic folklore, creating hybrid myths that made the foreign feel familiar. Even gossip traveled this way. The scandalous rumor of an English queen's infidelity might surface years later as a Bulgarian ballad about a faithless shepherdess, its origins blurred but its emotional truth intact. These roving narrators also functioned as medieval news networks. A Venetian minstrel's song about the Black Death spread could save lives by warning villagers ahead of the plague's march. In war zones, their coded lyrics, like the Occitan servants, passed tactical information under the guise of love songs, but their most enduring legacy was the shared storyscape they created. A merchant hearing a version of Cinderella in Cairo would recognize its bones when his Genos wife sang it at home, proof that even in fractured kingdoms, humanity's dreams traveled faster than swords or sickness. The paradox: these storytellers were often outcasts mistrusted by the courts they bypassed, branded thieves by innkeepers, yet welcomed eagerly when night fell and the stories began. Their power came from belonging nowhere and everywhere, making them the perfect vessels for tales that, like water, took the shape of whatever vessel held them but never lost their essential nature. While kings fought to fix history in stone, the minstrels let it flow like rivers, and in the end, it was their versions that soaked deepest into the world's memory. For centuries, storytellers relied solely on memory and voiced their art as fleeting as torch smoke in a drafty hall. But when the first quills scratched vellum, everything changed. The rise of illuminated manuscripts didn't just preserve tales, it transformed them into something both immortal and vulnerable. Suddenly, a bard's improvisations could be pinned like butterflies to parchment, their words frozen for scrutiny by rivals or kings. In Irish monasteries, scribes meticulously copied epic cycles like the Tain Bo Cuelnge, turning oral performances into inked masterpieces where every decorated initial and marginal doodle became a silent commentary on the text. The storyteller's living breath was now captive on the page, open to interpretation, or misinterpretation by readers who'd never hear the teller's inflection or see their wink. This shift reshaped the very nature of verbal duels, where once a skald could deny an ill-received verse as mere audience mishearing, written records left no room for evasion. The Icelandic sagas, transcribed centuries after their oral origins, bear scars of this transition, footnotes about alternative versions, hinting at fierce debates over which telling was canonical. Monasteries became battlegrounds of a different sort, where monks argued over whether to depict Cu Chulain's warp spasm as divine fury or demonic possession, based on which manuscript they referenced. The stakes: control over cultural memory itself, yet writing also gifted storytellers new weapons. The Welsh Cypher Wyddeaid began crafting Brud prophecies verses so ambiguously worded they could be reinterpreted with each political shift, their handwritten copies distributed like medieval propaganda pamphlets. Meanwhile, the Byzantine court's obsession with calligraphy turned manuscripts into luxury weapons. A gorgeously illuminated fable about a peacock prideful emperor made for a far subtler insult than anything spoken aloud. Even musical notation became a storytelling tool, with Neum's early sheet music allowing bards to replicate complex emotional cadences across continents, a revolutionary leap from the old oral transmissions, listen and repeat method. The most profound change, though, was the democratization of narrative. When Charlemagne's scribes standardized Carolingian minuscule script, they unwittingly gave birth to something radical: private reading. A noblewoman could now pore over tales without a bard's mediation, drawing her own conclusions. Storytelling contests adapted, with some judges demanding both oral performances and written submissions, testing a teller's ability to wield ink as deftly as inflection. The French trouvers took this further, leaving cheeky marginal notes in their manuscripts like "The Duke laughed here" or "The Countess scowled at this line," turning parchment into a virtual court where future readers became the audience. But the old ways didn't vanish, they hybridized. The Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf survives in a single fire-damaged manuscript, yet its alliterative verses still thrum with the rhythms of mead hall recitation. The Icelandic Eddas, though written, mimic oral formulae like "so the story goes" to maintain the illusion of live telling. Even the glorious Book of Kells, with its jewel-like illustrations, was likely read aloud to illiterate crowds, proof that the voice's power endured. What emerged wasn't the death of oral storytelling, but its evolution into a double-edged art, where the spoken word could now echo forever in ink, and every quill stroke carried the weight of a performance. On the mist-shrouded morning before battle lines clashed, armies often sent their most lethal weapons across the field first, not arrows or cavalry, but storytellers. These verbal champions stood between the bristling spears, trading boasts and prophecies like psychological arrows. When the Welsh prince Llewellyn ap Gruffydd faced English forces in the 13th century, his bard didn't just insult the enemy. He recited a centuries-old prophecy foretelling Celtic victory, sending a ripple of unease through Norman ranks. The English countered with their own skald, who twisted the tale into a warning about the folly of resisting fate. This wasn't mere pageantry, it was warfare by other means, where the right story could stiffen spines or unravel courage before a single sword was drawn. The Norse took this practice to its zenith. Before the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, a giant Viking berserker supposedly blocked the English advance, swinging his axe wildly while a skald at his back hurled verses about ancestral wrath. His songs didn't just mock King Harold's troops, they invoked the spectral fury of long-dead warriors, creating an aura of doom around the Viking shield wall. Though the berserker fell, his bard's words lingered, making the English victory feel haunted by the echoes of those curses. But the most cunning warlords used storytelling as covert strategy. During the 100 Years' War, French commanders employed trouvers to spread exaggerated ballads about English atrocities, burning churches, defiling relics through peasant villages. These weren't just songs, they were recruitment tools, turning local outrage into fresh troops. Meanwhile, English archers reportedly sang bawdy rhymes about French cowardice loud enough to carry across no man's land, aiming to provoke reckless charges. The stories themselves became terrain, as critical to control as high ground or river crossings. Sometimes the contests turned literal. The Scottish clan Macpherson famously challenged their rivals to a bardic duel rather than bloodshed in 1526. Each side's poet hurled verses across a loch for 3 days until one clan's stories ran dry. The defeated MacDonalds withdrew in shame, sparing dozens of lives. It was a rare acknowledgement that words at their best could be both weapon and peacemaker, though more often they simply made the coming violence feel righteous. What made these pre-battle duels so potent was their illusion of inevitability. A well-told prophecy didn't just predict the future, it shaped it. When Irish kern warriors heard their filly describe their chieftain's victory in the past tense, "He has broken their ranks, he has claimed the ford," it wasn't a forecast. It was a script, and every man who believed it became an actor ensuring the tale came true. Because in the end, battles weren't just won with steel. They were won in the space between a storyteller's breath and a listener's belief, that fragile, electrifying moment where words turned into worlds. The power to shape reality with words carries a shadow the weight of responsibility. Even in medieval courts, where storytelling was celebrated as an art, sharp minds questioned its darker edges. Was a bard spinning flattering tales for a tyrant any different from a blacksmith forging his chains? Philosophers like Thomas Aquinas grappled with this, arguing that stories, like swords, demanded moral stewardship. A well-placed fable could mend a community's fractures, but that same narrative, twisted, might justify oppression. The difference often lay in intent. When the Persian poet Ferdowsi spent 30 years crafting the Shahnameh, he wasn't just entertaining, he was preserving his culture's soul against the erasure of conquest. Yet down the road, a rival poet might tweak those very verses to paint the invaders as benevolent saviors. This tension between truth and manipulation played out in chilling ways. Church scribes editing pagan myths to fit Christian dogma weren't merely translating, they were rewriting cosmic order. A single altered line in a saint's biography could turn a local healer into a heretic, her followers into targets. The most skilled storytellers walked a razor's edge. The Welsh bard Dafydd ap Gwilym once faced exile for a satire deemed too cutting, while his contemporary Iolo Goch survived by cloaking critiques of nobility in rollicking drinking songs. Both understood the stakes. Words didn't just reflect power, they could redistribute it. Modern parallels are uncomfortably close. Political campaigns still harness the age-old trick of reducing complex issues to heroic or villainous archetypes, much like medieval chroniclers portraying kings as saints or devils based on who paid their fees. Social media algorithms, they're the new wandering minstrels, feeding us stories that confirm our biases while lining the pockets of digital overlords. The core dilemma remains unchanged when a viral narrative can spark revolutions or ruin lives. Do we hold storytellers accountable for the chaos they unleash? Yet there's a crucial distinction between past and present. Medieval audiences' new tales were crafted, even as they surrendered to their magic. Today's curated reality often wears the disguise of raw truth, making the ethical lines blurrier. Perhaps the lesson lies in the old Breton proverb whispered among bards: a story is a knife, it can slice bread or slit throats. The hand that wields it must choose wisely. The crackling hearths of royal courts grew quieter as the centuries turned, their once raucous storytelling duels muffled by the mechanical clatter of Gutenberg's invention. The printing press didn't just produce books, it dismantled an entire ecosystem of oral artistry, where a bard's survival had depended on the agility of their tongue and the favor of a fickle patron. Suddenly, a king could commission a flattering biography to be mass-produced and distributed, its words frozen in ink rather than shaped by the nightly whims of performance. Why host a storytelling contest when parchment could immortalize your glory without the risk of a rogue poet improvising an inconvenient truth? Centralized monarchies accelerated the decline. As kings like France's Louis XIV consolidated power, they replaced the chaotic spontaneity of court bards with controlled institutions, royal historians, state-sponsored theaters, and censored gazettes. The Tudor court, once a vibrant stage for competing balladeers, now employed official chroniclers of the realm to craft singular, unchallengeable narratives. The shift wasn't merely practical, it was philosophical. Oral tales had always been fluid, mutating with each retelling to reflect the audience's conscience. But printed words, they carried the weight of permanence, their authority bolstered by the very technology that reproduced them. Yet the storyteller's craft refused to die, it simply migrated. The coffeehouses of Enlightenment Europe became the new battlegrounds, where pamphleteers and playwrights dueled with quills instead of harps. Voltaire's satires sliced through aristocratic pretension just as sharply as any skald's insult poetry, while the epistolary novels of writers like Richardson transformed intimate stories into public spectacles debated in salons. Even the format of parliamentary speeches owed a debt to medieval bardic contests, with politicians borrowing the old tricks of rhythm, repetition, and emotional crescendo to sway their modern-day court. The most fascinating evolution emerged in the arts. Opera composers like Mozart revived storytelling duels in musical form. Think of the venomous aria battles in Don Giovanni, where characters weaponize melody just as skalds once wielded meter. Later, jazz musicians would improvise call and response riffs echoing the tension of Celtic flighting, while hip-hop battles resurrected the Norse tradition of manjafnatha, where verbal agility meant survival. Even reality TV competitions, with their judged performances and audience votes, unconsciously mirrored the ancient dynamic of royal storytelling contests, except now, the throne was a record deal or a viral following. What truly endured, though, was the human hunger for narrative combat. Today's online forums, from Twitter threads to Reddit debates, are digital mead halls where users clash over whose story will dominate the collective imagination. The algorithms governing our feeds function like capricious medieval monarchs, rewarding the tales that best capture attention, whether through humor, outrage, or heartbreak. The tools have changed, but the game remains the same: to bend the world to your story rather than the other way around. And somewhere in the echoes of a freestyle rap battle or a courtroom's closing argument, the ghost of a Viking skald smiles, knowing their art was never truly lost, only reborn. Step onto the neon-lit stage of a modern poetry slam, and you're stepping into the same arena where medieval bards once clashed. Only now, the torches have been replaced by spotlights, and the throne's favor has morphed into viral fame. The rules of engagement haven't changed. Hold the crowd's attention hostage with your voice, dismantle your opponent's narrative with sharper wit, and leave the audience so spellbound they'll crown you the victor in applause. Today's spoken word artists don't just recite verses. They wage wars of rhythm and resonance, where a well-placed pause or a searing metaphor can turn the tide like a skald's improvised insult once did in a Viking hall. The trophies may be microphones shaped instead of golden arm rings, but the hunger for influence, that's eternal. Political debates reveal the same ancient DNA. Watch two candidates parry on a podium, and you're witnessing a flighting duel in tailored suits. The medieval trick of wrapping criticism in allegory lives on in sound bites and attack ads where a mention of swamp creatures isn't about wildlife but corruption, just as a bard's fable about a thieving fox once implied a noble's greed. Even the pacing mirrors old techniques: repetition for emphasis, lock her up, echoing like a Norse cunning, emotional crescendos to stir the crowd, and strategic pauses that let the subtext sink in like poison. The stakes, instead of land grants, it's polling percentages, but the game is identical. Shape the story, and you shape the kingdom. Social media influencers are the wandering minstrels of the digital age, trading loot strings for hashtags. Their courts are Instagram grids and TikTok feeds, where attention is currency and every post is a bid for patronage. Like medieval bards adapting tales to flatter local lords, influencers curate personas to match their audience's desires. Wellness gurus as modern-day saints dispensing herbal remedies instead of holy relics, or finance bros playing the role of court jesters, mocking avocado toast while hawking crypto. The most successful even replicate the old risk-reward balance. A viral tweet can land brand deals the new feudal contracts, while one misstep triggers the digital equivalent of exile cancellation. What binds these modern iterations to their medieval ancestors is the unshakable power of narrative alchemy. A politician's folksy anecdote, a poet's gut-punch closing line, an influencer's carefully staged candid moment, all are spells cast to transform perception. The tools have upgraded from harps to algorithms, but the human brain still responds to the same triggers: conflict, catharsis, and the illusion of shared secrets. That's why conspiracy theories spread like 21st century prophecies, why TED Talks borrow the structure of heroic sagas, and why a courtroom's closing argument leans on the same rhetorical devices a medieval bard used to defend a clansman's honor. The through line is clear: storytelling was never just entertainment. It's the operating system of human persuasion, coded in the Middle Ages and endlessly rebooted for new eras. So the next time you see a viral tweet or a debate zinger, listen closer. Beneath the pixels and polish, you'll hear the echo of a harp's last trembling note and the ghost of a long-dead bard whispering, "I taught you that." The echoes of those medieval storytelling duels still reverberate through our modern world, proving that while thrones may crumble, the power of a well-told tale is timeless. Those bards and skalds understood something we're only now rediscovering in the age of viral tweets and algorithmic feeds. Whoever controls the narrative controls the future. Their battles weren't just about entertainment, they were about survival, about etching their version of truth into the collective imagination before a rival could overwrite it. Today's influencers and politicians might not carry harps, but they're playing the same ancient game, crafting stories that shape what we believe, what we fear, and ultimately how we act. Consider how effortlessly a medieval trickster's strategies translate to our screens. The Welsh bard who tweaked a familiar legend to flatter his patron. That's the political speechwriter reframing history to suit their candidate. The Norse skald who spread rumors through tavern ballads. That's the anonymous meme account seeding conspiracy theories across forums. Even the Church's use of illuminated manuscripts to standardize doctrine finds its counterpart in today's carefully curated news cycles. The tools have evolved, but the human mind still responds to the same triggers: emotional resonance, tribal belonging, the sweet intoxication of feeling like you've uncovered hidden truth. Yet there's a crucial difference between then and now. Medieval audiences knew they were being courted, that every tale came with an agenda. The storyteller stood visible in the torchlight, their craft celebrated as performance rather than disguised as objectivity. Perhaps that's the most vital lesson we can steal from those long-gone wordsmiths, the wisdom to recognize when we're being woven into someone else's narrative. Whether it's a brand's origin story, a nation's founding myth, or even the personal stories we tell ourselves about success and failure, every version leaves out as much as it includes. So the next time you feel a surge of righteous anger from a headline, or find yourself nodding along to a pundit's catchy phrase, pause. Ask yourself what 11th century bard might be grinning behind those words. Because the throne they're fighting for isn't made of wood or gold anymore. It's made of attention spans and retweets, and it's just as slippery as any medieval crown. The real magic trick isn't learning to spot the strings. It's realizing we've all been storytellers all along, whispering our own versions of reality into existence with every choice, every share, every quiet moment we decide which tales deserve